We've been learning about the First Peoples all our lives, but what about the First Peoples themselves? How and what have they been learning? Because statistically, they're not doing so well in school. That leads me to my question. What is causing such a massive gap in education between on and off reserve schools? How has the government tried to provide culturally relevant education and eliminate this gap? This question addresses one of the 94 calls to action, which is to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding between First Nations children on reserve and the ones off reserve. To understand everything going on here, let's first go through what reserves actually are and how they've been intertwined with many of the issues in Indigenous education. So, long ago, the Indigenous had their own system of governing land usage and cultural practices. Then, European settlers arrived and began to assert control over land. There were many treaties involving land rights and resources in exchange for the first peoples to surrender their land. Then, the Indian Act of 1876 was enacted to regulate almost every aspect of indigenous life, such as governance, education, and land. It established the legal framework for reserves, which are areas of land set aside for the use of specific First Nations. Not to mention, they were often given less desirable land or extremely isolated locations, and even then, the government would violate the treaties and slowly shrink or take away land from their reserves for their own use. In the present, the land is still technically owned by the government, and the First Peoples aren't allowed to have private ownership over their land and resources. That causes reserves to have some of the poorest living conditions in Canada, with there being a heavy reliance on insufficient government funds for education, housing, social welfare, and infrastructure. There's an especially noticeable gap in graduation rates, as in the 2021 to 2022 school year, only 46.1% of on reserve Indigenous students graduated with a Dogwood diploma, compared to 68.7% of off reserve Indigenous students, which is a difference of 22.6%. But the worst of it is yet to come, as the graduation rates for off reserve Indigenous students had an increase of 6.7% since the 2016 to 2017 school year, while the on reserve rates were only an increase of 0.5%. So, what does this tell us? Well, firstly, there's a massive gap between on and off reserve education for Indigenous students, and that's not to mention the average graduation rates of all students in BC are higher than that of both. Secondly, off reserve education saw a substantial increase, while on reserve education barely had a difference. Now, the main issue we'll be talking about today are the disparities in terms of funding and resources between on and off reserve schools. This gets especially interesting because the First Peoples are generally a federal responsibility while education is provincially managed. And at the same time, some First Nations are negotiating for self governance. So here's a massive issue. If the First Nations are fully responsible for their own schools, the funding model changes. So, off reserve schools are provincially managed, which means there's a standard and predictable budget each year, with comprehensive funding models that account for many factors such as special needs, the overall cost of living in an area, and more. While there are accountability frameworks, which can include standardized tests and evaluations that influence the funding, the system generally allows for long term sustainable funding. On reserve funds are provided by the federal government, or Indigenous Services Canada, and is calculated based on how many students are enrolled each year. The funds are a lot more flexible, and the First Nations are allowed to allocate their funds to suit their community's priorities, such as spending more money on support for transportation if they're in a particularly secluded area, or spending more funding on teaching languages. However, this causes a potential lack for additional services or supports, such as for people with disabilities, extracurriculars, among others. Schools' facilities such as science labs, libraries, and technological resources are also affected by inadequate funding. And as said before, there's inadequate funding for housing, infrastructure, and more. The terrible socio-economic conditions of reserves has an effect, such as low employment rates, meaning a good amount of children don't have employed parents. The parental generations themselves wouldn't have the best education, and transportation and reduced access to provincial services would also contribute to such a low graduation rate. Now, this issue of funding creates an entirely new branch of problems we're going to talk about, which is hiring teachers and providing a culturally relevant education. On reserve schools are meant to have curriculums that are almost exclusively tailored towards the needs of a First Nation student. And in BC, that's exactly what happens, with the British Columbia Tripartite Agreement actually allowing First Nations to adjust the curriculum to their own cultural and linguistic needs. However, there were some conditions, such as the fact that they need to learn 21st century technological stuff and have the skills needed to thrive in a contemporary or current day society. And while it's nice that on-reserve schools are able to adjust the curriculum to their own needs while still keeping a balance with modern-day skills, they're still underfunded, meaning it's harder to hire qualified teachers, and especially ones that can teach the First Peoples' cultures or languages, as well as in a way that's not insensitive. The government themselves have acknowledged many of these facts, such as in a survey called Let's Talk On-Reserve Education. It seems that they are well aware of the issues at hand here, and while we haven't seen any substantial improvements so far, they've directly addressed the call to action here. It's in progress, with new funding models proposed worth multiple billions of dollars over the next couple of years to solve this issue. There has been a $2 billion investment for the construction of 71 new schools from 2016, of which 41 has been completed, benefiting around 17,000 students. There has also been renovations made to 103 out of 153 schools proposed so far. They've also proposed in the 2024 budget $649.4 million over 2 years for education up to secondary unreserved and $545.1 million to build better learning environments. They're looking forward to developing regional educational agreements between the First Nations that will be able to respond to the unique needs and priorities of these First Nation communities. There have been 10 of these so far, and many more are coming in the future. So, now we can all see that to improve on-reserve schools, we need sufficient funding and infrastructure, including special needs, transportation, qualified teachers, as well as improved general living conditions. The government has been working hard over the last few years to provide programs and a better funding model, which will hopefully show tangible results in the near future. I hope this video has helped you understand the surface of what the government owes the First Nations, at least in the field of education. The future of education in Canada may depend on the steps we take today. Maybe you will be a part of the change that creates a more equitable educational system for all students.